Today we're going to focus on how Nietzsche's philosophy mistranslated into political program of National Socialism. I really like how you use Nietzsche as a cautionary tale for philosophy. As I read Nietzsche's Gay Science, I was thinking, thank God the third wave feminism never came across that book. Thank God they don't read books. Okay, so the twist of Nietzsche's philosophies by the Nazis really reveals one part of philosophical ideas that is kind of fragile when detached from their ethical grounding and context. And I think Nietzsche's works are deliberately provocative and meant to challenge readers to wrestle with ideas rather than deliver fixed dogmas. This open-ended philosophy is susceptible to misinterpretation, just like how Nazis co-opted his ideas, despite opposition to the underlying principles. And I think this really highlights a paradox that a philosophy designed to liberate can also become a tool of oppression. So the problem lies not just in Nietzsche's philosophy, but in the philosophical literacy of society. And now I believe we have a culture that is steeped in intellectual laziness, so to speak. And that can turn any complex philosophy into propaganda. So I think that the lazier the society, the higher the chance of turning philosophy into propaganda. So do you think philosophers have like a what would you say, like a dual obligation, where not only to present ideas that challenge and elevate humanity, but also to anticipate potential of those ideas that could be misused in the world? Or is that fully a responsibility of a society?
You're emphasizing, I think, correctly ways in which later political philosophers and activists, including the National Socialists, misused his philosophy or mistranslated it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but at the same time, we should include ways in which they properly took Nietzsche and did accurately see him as a forerunner of their views. So the first then general question would be to say what in Nietzsche was properly used and what was misused by the later generation of political thinkers and activists. Then a more general question about philosophy that you're putting out, the advantages and disadvantages or power, but also potential for abuse of that power and misuse. And so what responsibility do philosophers have to put their views out there, but also perhaps with warning labels or cautionary things? Don't mistranslate this in this way. And then a third set of issues is the general culture within philosophy is placed. So if one has an intellectually lazy culture, as I think that was your phrase, how much of the responsibility for, say, ignoring philosophy or paying attention to philosophy but misusing that philosophy lies not with the philosophers but with the intellectually lazy or other vices that are at work in the general publication. So I think those are three great questions. Let's start with the Nietzsche question, though. I think it is fair to say that the Nazis did misuse some of Nietzsche's views. So take, for example, the most properly notorious things that the Nazis are famous for. Their anti-Semitism that is turned into an active intellectual framework and an active cultural and political program to exterminate a whole set of people, most prominently the Jews, but then some other ones there. And I think here that Nietzsche would have been properly appalled by the Nazis. I think it's fair to say that Nietzsche had some low-grade anti-Semitism in his views. But when we are talking about a more atavistic, I want to elevate myself and think of myself as superior simply because I'm a member of a different ethnic group or a different cultural group. It's not an intellectual opposition to the Jews. Nietzsche did not have very much of that. He had some, but not very much. But the pathological forms of anti-Semitism that the Nazis represent, Nietzsche was very critical of those people. He saw them as psychological weaklings, as a kind of unmanly, unmasculine people who were trying to elevate themselves they don't have any particular strength, so they're trying for kind of a cheap ego boost by hating on some other group. So to the extent that the National Socialists represent that kind of anti-Semitism forthrightly, and they do, Nietzsche would have been appalled by them, and there's a huge divorce there. Now, at the same time, Nietzsche, when he was younger, had some kind of German nationalistic aspirations. He was proud to some extent of some Germanic things and some of the German historical accomplishments. But as he matured intellectually, and I think as also as an individual, he came to see contemporary Germany, that is to say now Germany of the 1870s, 80s, and so on, as a pathological society, as again a society that was decadent. And so he stopped trying to think of himself as a German. He certainly stopped thinking of German nationalism as something healthy. So he started to think about himself as a kind of a pan-European type of thinker, to become more cosmopolitan. And we also see him explicitly admiring the psychological and social type, the more master type in other cultures. So, he would praise the samurai, he would praise the Arabs when they rose up, he praised the Vikings, and so on. So, to the extent then that the National Socialists were nationalist of the German variety, then clearly Nietzsche would then be their enemy. But I do want to say, on the other side, I do think there are lots of ways in which Nietzsche was properly used by the Nazis, and that he is part of a piece. There's a huge amount of bloodthirstiness in Nietzsche. The idea that reality is a matter of conflict. It's a conflict between individuals. It's a conflict between groups. That any sort of society that those Western liberals in England, for example, or more broadly Britain and America represent, the idea that we should become capitalists and make stuff and trade with each other and aspire for peace and be tolerant and so forth. That entire philosophical framework Nietzsche rejects, and he rejects it fundamentally. So he is in a tradition that says life is conflict. Life is war. Life is about exploitation of the stronger, of the weaker by the stronger, and celebrating an ethic and a culture and a politics that is explicitly bloodthirsty and warlike. Now, to the extent then that Nietzsche is in that philosophical tradition, he is very much anti-Western, anti-individualist, anti-liberal, anti-peace, and to that extent, at that general level of abstraction, the Nazis are one possible, legitimate political outcome from that kind of a philosophical framing. So I think there's going to be a mixed evaluation that comes out of the question of to the extent to which Nietzsche was abused or properly used by the Nazis.
Just as far as philosophy goes, I think that philosophy is kind of like an art of shaping uncertainty into narrative, right? So it's a way of
Yes.
transforming abstract concepts into a story that like weaves together different experiences into like a meaningful whole. You said the Nazism was fundamentally a philosophy-driven movement that was shaped by intellectual elites. But how do you reconcile with this like multiple contributing factors like economic collapse or political instability or social unrest? I mean, that also played a crucial role, right? Do you think these social economic conditions were way less significant than the philosophical ideas?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And unquestionably, if we then go to the 1920s in Germany and early 1930s, people do not form their philosophies, their religions, and decide whom to vote for by reflecting on their abstract philosophical ideas only. But one way to think about this then is going to be historically. So suppose we want to say, let's take World War I. Germany lost World War I. And so that, from their perspective, is a disastrous political event. So it means that their political aspirations are dashed. There were punitive measures put in place as a result of the Versailles Treaty. And so there are economic downstream things that occur as a result of their losing the war. But then also there is this cultural superiority issue that to a large extent Germans before the war thought of themselves as a superior ethnicity, as a superior culture, and that anything that they would do, they would naturally win. So when they lost the war, it was a huge blow to their pride, so to speak, their ethnic pride. How could we possibly lose the war to those decadent British and French who are obviously inferior to us? So that's already then to say there are kind of cultural, psychological factors and downstream political factors and economic factors that are operative, as well as all of the philosophical factors, that German culture is being shaped by thinkers like Hegel and Fichte and Kant and Marx and Nietzsche and so on. So how do we sort out the importance of all of those? Now, the danger for me, since I'm a philosopher, is to, so I'm a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So to want to explain everything, right, in terms of philosophical ideas playing themselves out. And I don't want to do that. So then we get into the issue of how do we weight these various factors? How important was the economy? How important was the politics and so on? So the way I would approach that is to say, here I think history is really valuable. So then you say, in the grand sweep of history, how many nations have lost wars and have been, as a result of those wars, politically devastated, economically punished, and then psychologically shocked that we could lose to those people we thought we couldn't possibly lose to. So then we say, well, once you start studying history, that's a very common story, just because there have been tens or hundreds of thousands of wars across history. So there always is a loser, and almost always the loser is devastated in various respects. So then the question is, if we're looking for a causal explanation, how many of those losers of those wars across history within 10 years are gung-ho about National Socialism and ready to elect people like Adolf Hitler to power with that particular ideological approach? And then you say, well, not very many, right? It's many nations that have lost wars, but their reaction was quite different. So the other way to think about that would then be, if you could say, compare the political philosophy and the cultural philosophy of Germany in the 1920s with that of its neighbor or near neighbor to the south down in Italy. And then you say, well, there's National Socialist political philosophy and there's fascist political philosophy. And they are, very close cousins or very close siblings in a lot of ways, right? So, they are coming from the same part of the political philosophical framework. Now, if we then want to say, well, the reason why the Germans rather, turned to Nazism was because they lost World War I and all of the downstream stuff happened there, then we're going to have a very big problem explaining why almost an identical political philosophy sweeps Italy in the 1920s, because Italy did not lose the war. Italy, in fact, joined the war a little bit late, but it was on the winning side of the war. So the way I would put this point is to say, if your explanation is Germany lost the war, so they turned to Hitler as their salvation in some sense, that has to be a weak explanation, because Italy won the war, but the Italians were no less enthusiastic about bringing Mussolini to power with an almost identical program. So the way I would also put this is just to individualize this. It's hard to think in terms of millions and millions of people and what their culture is and what their voting habits are. So the social science is very complicated, but we can understand this, I think, better at the individual level. So, and we can say, well, there's no causal determination here that says you have to become some sort of Nazi in your psychology as a response to that. It's quite possible that what you will just do is to say, well, I give up on life, I'm a loser, and I just crawl into some hole for the rest of my life. What at the individual level is going to predict how you respond to a disaster that happens in your life is not the disaster per se. It's going to be what is your background, psychological and ideational set. What are your principles? What are your character? That's going to predict and be much more explanatory of how you respond to the disasters in your life. And people with different background character sets and different background ideational sets will react to the same sort of disasters in very different ways. So that's why, and this is a long-winded way of saying that I think to draw the analogy, the background character and background ideational set for German culture in the 1920s was shaped by the big thinkers in Germany. So there had been a lot of cultural and philosophical groundwork that shaped how Germans in general, particularly their intellectual and cultural leadership, was thinking in the 1920s. So when things go well, they're going to react in a certain way because of that background philosophical set. When things go badly, they're going to react in a certain way because of that background philosophical set and so forth. In the same way, as individuals, we know if you know that person's belief system, you know their character, you can predict better how they are going to respond when things are going well and when things are going to go badly. That's going to be more predictive.
William James actually wrote a book, maybe you've heard about it. It's called What Makes a Life Significant? And it states that what appeals most to a man is the heroic struggle with the adversity of faith in the name of some high ideals. As soon as the fruit is being eaten, things become dishonorable. So we need risk and mystery and determination. So ideas have an impact, but ideals kind of inflame the emotions. So I think the Nazis were also more than capable of offering that to German society. I think idealism was one of these 5 points of the Nazi program, right? It was collectivism and economic socialism and authoritarianism and nationalism and then idealism. And also, I think it's fair to point out so that people know all the thought leaders of Nazism were very well educated Germans. I mean, those were one of the best educated men and women. The Nazi party activists had PhDs sometimes. I mean, these people were not mediocre. And they saw themselves as disciples of Nietzsche. Could it be that how atheists today misinterpret God is kind of like similar to how Nazis misinterpreted Nietzsche about his individualism? Because just as Nietzsche's ideas were co opted by Nazis to support authoritarianism, some atheists critique faith as like inherently oppressive. So, and totally dismissing the value of individual spiritual experiences and moral frameworks that can emerge from their religious beliefs.
Exactly, yes.
It's what I called a religious placebo effect. Nietzsche said, it's my ambition to say in 10 sentences what others say in the whole book. I don't want to get into religion, but I think also, as far as misunderstanding Christianity goes, I think Jordan Peterson did like a religious version of that with his YouTube series on Bible studies, So he kind of like presented to people what the church couldn't present in the last couple of decades. And he also said that God is dead and we've killed him. So he was an atheist, but what I'm thinking is he said that we have killed him. So how do you kill something that doesn't exist? Did he see God as like a moral framework of a sort, or what was his take on that?
Yes, that's right. So we have the education level of the Nazis being very high by cultural historical standards. We have that very insightful remark from William James about aspirations and psychological motivation and people wanting something heroic. We have the issue of whether atheists in general are misinterpreting God for whatever reason. And then that would then to say, well, how should we understand God and what are the various interpretations?
I think Nietzsche had a very similar interpretation of God as some people who call themselves religious. I don't know who said it. I don't believe in the same God you don't believe in.
So, you're quite right. He is an atheist, so he doesn't believe in God. Right? So there is something a little bit paradoxical in Nietzsche's formulation. He doesn't believe that all of the historical gods existed. Instead, on his view, the invention of gods is to serve a certain psychological function for individuals. In some cases, it's to have a father figure who provides moral guidance in the world, or it's because people fear death and they want to believe that there's, once death occurs, they're going to go to a nice place, hopefully, and so that consoles them in various ways. So he, like many others before him, is arguing that we have to better understand human psychology, and anytime there's a weakness in one's psychology, right, religion provides a solution, but it's a placebo solution, to borrow your word, to deal with that psychological weakness in the human being. Now, and then you can then say, well, humans have lots of different psychological weaknesses that are possible to them, so we would expect that there's a variety of types of religions designed to help people cope with those psychological problems. And then some of the bigger, more complicated religions, of course, are going to bundle together all of those solutions to various psychological problems as well. So if you think, for example, you're all stressed out because of economic concerns, I don't think I can provide for myself, then God, being a provider, is going to make you feel better about yourself. If you are afraid of death, right, then there being an afterlife that God will provide for you, that makes you feel better about your life. If you are feeling, for whatever reason, that you are a worthless person, that you've done all sorts of terrible things, and so you are plagued with feelings of guilt and so on, a religion that comes along and says, well, we can wipe the slate clean, you can start over with a kind of an unlimited forgiveness, that's going to be powerful for that kind of psychological weak person as well. And then some religions will just package all of those together along with various other ones. But what Nietzsche is grappling with, though, is the fact that in the modern world, why it is, he thinks, that so many people are so still religious. And then particularly by the time we get into the early 1800s and into the middle 1800s, there seems to be a religious revivalism that is going on. And then on his grounds, that has to be because there's a lot of psychological weakness suddenly out there. People, and it might just be that, the modern world is becoming too complicated, and people's capacity for handling the complexities of the modern world is not keeping up. So they go back to, and they want something simpler, and they want someone who has all of the answers to be given to them in a nice, pretty package. And so maybe that's going to be the explanation for the religious revivalism. But what he means by saying that God is dead and we have killed him is to say that in the modern world, we can't believe in God the way people say in medieval times, when 98% of the population was illiterate, when people were poor, much, much poorer, when life expectancy was so much shorter, that instead, as modernization has occurred, people have become literate. So that then is to say they know more and they become smarter. And even if you don't think of yourself as a particularly scientific-minded person, nonetheless, you are living in a scientific culture, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and we just pick up huge amounts of scientific explanations of the world, even if we are not studious in the scientific way. And that also even by a process of cultural osmosis means, I don't believe in kind of old-fashioned religious explanations of the world anymore. Maybe there are some people who believe in ghosts and witches, and when you get sick that you should pray to God. But by and large, when we get sick, we're looking for naturalistic explanations. We go to a physician. We don't go to a priest, right? We don't sacrifice a chicken in the backyard anymore. We take pills, right, and so forth. And this is even the people who think of themselves as being religious by the time we get to the 1800s. The other thing that goes along with that is not just the science part of it, so that science is slowly replacing religion in popular culture with explanations, but also that as we become modernistic, we become a lot more individualistic, right, in our thinking. This is not only like a political individualism. I have my right to life, my liberty, pursuit of happiness, and you have yours, and we're going to tolerate each other, and we're all free agents and so on. All of that certainly is a part of it, and that political individualism makes it much harder for people to accept authorities who are above them. But again, in the modern world, we are replacing not only the political authorities, right? We're getting rid of all of the feudalisms, right? And the idea that there's a tribal chief or there's a king, and we just have to do whatever the tribal chief or the king says. That we are free agents in some sense. You can't push me around, and I'm going to stand up to the government. That individualism politically means that when religious institutions come along and say people in the religious hierarchy should have more power over your mind, your thinking, your life than you do. To us in the modern world, that sounds like you're asking me to join a cult. And I don't join a cult. I go my own way. And then also the part of the individualism, I think for myself. People are much more literate. They are much more educated. So instead of just saying you are the priest or you are in some hierarchy and only the elite hierarchy can say what God really means and interpret the text for you, and you just have to listen in church on Sunday and do whatever your priest tells you or believe whatever your priest wants to tell you. No, I can read the Bible for myself, and I can read other religions for myself, and I can think for myself. To the extent that people then are more cognitively independent, they don't trust intellectual authorities as much, and they don't have faith in those intellectual authorities. But that faith in intellectual authority was one of the great pillars of traditional religion. So again, all of that is being swept aside. So what we have is people are more scientific, they are thinking more for themselves, and they are kind of culturally, politically much more don't push me around. That then is to say, those three pillars of traditional religion have gone away culturally. And so it's a metaphorical way of saying religion has died out in our culture, and God is dead is simply an arresting rhetorical formulation of that.
So if you presented your morals or what you see as moral to Nietzsche, he would do a genealogy. And then once you hear the story of the origin of your morality, it will probably undermine your confidence in it. So if you say there's no way someone can ever see killing people as moral, he would say, well, that's how indoctrinated you are in adopting moral frames, right? And fair enough, because seeing racism and slavery as wrong, it's a fairly new phenomenon looking at the history, right? What did he mean by we will have to create our own values? I assume he didn't see morality and religion interconnected in any way. He separated them totally.
Yes, no, that's another great question. So the official doctrine of religions, traditionally, right, has been that human beings are not creators of values. Instead, they are subject to values. So the official version is to say there's a God or there are gods, and they are the ones who create the values, and they legislate those values. And then typically, if you have a polytheistic religion, then you'll say, well, the different gods are in competition with each other and they create different values. And so that means that human beings have a difficult task sometimes of figuring out, should I follow Zeus on this or should I be following Athena on this? Because I'm getting different conflicting value frameworks. The more monotheistic religions then want to say, no, there's one God, and so we have a more unified and hopefully internally consistent, right, set of values, so you don't have that kind of conflict. So there, what we have is just in religious form a debate between universalists and relativists over moral values. But the part that your question is interested in is to say that human beings aren't making up these values. We receive them from the gods, and fundamentally our position is as I am intellectually a subject. I don't question the gods. I accept the values and obedient to those values on the basis of them. Now, if though we start to be skeptical about the existence of any gods, then we can't adopt that story anymore. Then we have to say, well, we have all of these moral values and moral beliefs, and sometimes they seem internally consistent or to fit facts of reality. Sometimes they seem inconsistent, but where do we get them from if we aren't receiving them from gods or from a tradition that traces its way back to some original God speaking to a prophet or somewhere? And so at that point, you do have to say human beings are creative of values. So it must be that we made them up. And Nietzsche is in that tradition of saying those people who make up religions are creative, right? But they are making up a religion and a mythic understanding of gods in order to account for or give consolation or validation to their subjective psychological states. Right? So if, for example, I believe in a God from Nietzsche's perspective, who is all-powerful and very angry from me and asks me 5 times or 6 times a day to fall on my face and ask him for forgiveness and to tell me what to do, right? Well, officially I'm believing in a super powerful God who is angry, but for Nietzsche is to say, no, you have created that God in your own mind because you are a kind of person who likes to submit or needs to submit, and your religion is just an externalization of that. So gods are made up, religions are made up, and we create them. And then there would be an interesting analogy to what artists do. Artists have a certain psychological framework, and artists create some sort of artificial reality that they then want to lose themselves in. And then as consumers, if we like that reality, we go along with the program and lose ourselves in that artificial creation. The only difference there is that most of the time in the case of art, we recognize that we are stepping into an illusory framework and we step out of it to get on with our ordinary lives. Part of religion from Nietzsche's perspective is that people really convince themselves that they're not doing that, that they really are stepping into a real framework. So there's, from his perspective, an additional level of delusion that's going on there. Now, then the question is going to be, this is the second part of your question, how do we do that? How do we actually create values? And Nietzsche wants to say, again, that not all human beings fall into the same category here. Some people do have an active imagination and a strong will, so they are the ones who are going to be able to replace God, so to speak. I don't need a God to tell me what to do. I'm going to just make up my own values, right? Subjectively, legislate my own life in terms of those, and because he has this conflict understanding of human relations, try to legislate for other people so that other people follow my value framework. Other people, he thinks, are weak. They don't have much imagination, they don't have much will, but nonetheless, they do need something to believe in, so they're going to be the followers. They're going to be the ones who just, somebody else has come up with some sort of framework. It pushes their buttons in some ways psychologically, so I don't have to go through all of the effort of creating it myself and trying to impose it. I can just follow along in someone else's footsteps. So from Nietzsche's perspective, he does think values are created, right? They're not discovered in the world. So he is a subjectivist in that metaphysical sense. But that then generalizing from his sense, he thinks everything fundamentally is subjective. Now the difference, if we want to then just say on this subjectivism is, and I think Nietzsche would probably account for it this way, is to say, some people of course want to say there are no gods, but we do have all of these values. Where do these values come from? And their answer is to say from society, right? So it's not that I get to make up my own values and impose them on the world. Instead, I'm born into a society, and that society has pre-existing values, and I get conditioned into believing in that society's values. But of course, there are different societies that have created different values over time, so we're stuck in a kind of cultural relativistic framework. And Nietzsche, I think, would not deny at all that kind of the cultural relativism is true as a descriptive fact. There are all of these different cultures out there, and they have different value frameworks and so on. Nietzsche would just be psychologically scathing about anybody who thinks that that's the proper explanation, right, for where values come from. If you think that somehow society comes up with values, he says that's just shallow. Societies don't come up with anything. Societies always are under the sway of the most active, the most charismatic of individuals. It's always some individuals who are coming up with these values. It's just that the vast majority of people in society are herd followers. And so if you think, oh, my mommy and my daddy taught me to believe this, and everybody that I run into in church believes the same sort of thing, therefore society has created values. That's just to say that you are kind of a passive, weak-minded person who just lets other people legislate for you. The more active-minded person is going to say, my mom and dad, they might be fine people, but chances are very good that they're like 99% of all other moms and dads. They're just following the herd as well. And so if I'm going to be my own self, if I have some strong will, at some point I'm going to question my mom and dad. I will rebel against my mom and dad. I'm going to not only move out of the house, so to speak, and become independent, but I'm going to move out of their intellectual framework and start thinking for myself, right? Or if I go to church or whatever, I look around my neighborhood and I see just a whole bunch of very ordinary people. Why would I conform to their way of thinking about the world? They're not special at all. The only kind of people who worries about what their neighbors think is already a weak-minded kind of person in the first place. So it's then fundamentally a decision of whether you are going to create your own values or whether you are going to be a herd follower of values that some other individuals have created.
This is it's very fair to point out. I think people mistaken Nietzsche's empowerment of the individual with an overall individualistic view, because I think Nietzsche was more concerned with this with species than individual per se. But so he's an interesting mix of both. But I think that fundamentally he was more of a collectivist, and I think he also offered this secular version of God speaking through prophet, and so the prophet is like a tool of God, right? So I think he said that the power force is a biological one. So his great men are special individuals who have powerful evolutionary forces that work through them, but these individuals don't use power, but the power uses them. So the will to power works through them to create something
Yeah,
powerful.
that's very well said.
I don't want to criticize Nietzsche, but that's pretty grandiose. I know he was not a fan of democracy, and the Nazis were sort of what we say players of democracy. They used democracy to achieve something anti-democratic.
Exactly.
But did he offer us an alternative, Nietzsche?
Yeah. Uh, well, yes and no. Nietzsche's politics is a hard thing to sort out because he doesn't at any point lay out any sort of systematic political program or even any systematic political principles. He is much more interested in the psychology, right, of social movements and the psychology of individuals who are able to transcend social movements or avoid social movements or create social movements in the first place. And as you say, he's very interested culturally in the genealogy or even more broadly the history of those cultures that have been able to actually accomplish something in society. So the samurai Japanese, the Romans, right, the Vikings, Germany back in the day when it was great, and so on. And then also because of his more particular interests, those individuals in those cultures who are head and shoulders above anyone else. The great artists, mostly, particularly the great musicians. So, just as a slightly side point, I think it is extremely important that while Nietzsche does celebrate military conquerors and some scientists and some other cultural figures who clearly are above the herd and much more important. In his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, it is artistic figures and art that he thinks is the most significant cultural vehicle. So the book is The Birth of Tragedy, and he's reflecting on tragedy in literature primarily. But it's also interesting that the subtitle of that book is Out of the Spirit of Music. So in some way, he thinks music is the most fundamental psychological force, or the most psychologically revelatory, rather, thing that we need to study to try to figure out what's going on in humans individually and psychologically.
I think Nietzsche was in generally a lot more deconstructing than constructing.
Yeah,
I think at some point critique needs to transition into creation.
yeah,
You know what I mean? And is it even possible to meaningfully critique something without some foundational principles or values? And I think this goes to postmodernists as well. But offering an alternative, I understand he wants us to think on our own, but you know, just talking about the Übermensch, and this may be my misunderstanding, but the Übermensch and in a non-democratic system, if we have individuals, I mean, democracy ensures that every person has a voice, and it's a society where instead of hierarchy, it reflects collective self-mastery. It seems like he is unaware of also he seems like he's unaware of the industrial revolution as well, but he destructs something, but then he doesn't then he doesn't find an alternative to fill it in. He just leaves the wound open.
no, I think that's a fair set of remarks, and it does take us, I think, into some deep issues in Nietzsche. I think you're right to say mostly he is, to borrow the later phrase, deconstructing, right? And so I think there are some strong connections to later generations that turn to postmodernism, as we now call it. At the same time, he does throw out lots and lots of remarks that point in a positive direction. But I think at the same time, you're right to say he never gathers all of those remarks and presents systematically what that positive new direction, right, would be. So we know that he's anti-capitalist. He's not interested in the Industrial Revolution. He's not interested, or that he's very much anti-democratic. He's anti-socialist. He's anti-Christian. He's anti-Jew. He's anti all sorts of things. And at various points, he does say, nonetheless, there have been great human beings. Wagner early in his career, Beethoven, the great Greek tragedians, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and so on. So why doesn't he turn to a more positive, systematic program, or tell us in specific what, once we get past the decay and the decline and the nihilism and we turn the corner, what some of these positive values are going to be? Now here I think there is a problem for Nietzsche in one sense, that if he wants to say that really people who are herd followers, sheep-like, are disgusting human beings, and he does use this very normatively charged language all of the time, right? To be a sheep instead of being a wolf, right? Or to be a rabbit who's always scared all of the time instead of being an eagle or a lion, right, and so forth. So he does seem then to say that that there are some things that are in fact right and some things that are in fact wrong for human beings. That human beings who are strong, who are powerful, who have self-mastery, who don't give in to the herd way of thinking about it, those people are the better people, and they are the hope for the species, as you put it. So he wants there to be Übermenschen, right, who will then elevate the species to a new and stronger point. So in that case, he does seem to say that there is an objective and this is the philosophically charged term, an objective distinction between strong and weak. Strong is good, weak is bad, and anything in human beings that helps us to evolve stronger is good. And then so the right kind of psychology, the right kind of social institutions that enable that are going to be the good. Now, at the same time, while Nietzsche is saying all of that stuff, the rest of his philosophy militates against him being able to say that there are objectively grounded distinctions between good and bad. Because part of his philosophy then is to say, whatever is a value is just something that someone has subjectively legislated. And there are no gods who have done this subjective legislation. Instead, it's just a psychological projection, right, in words and formula, linguistic formulations of one's deepest biological impulses. So philosophically, then, at the same time, it seems like all Nietzsche can say is, I, Nietzsche, happen to respond positively to assertions of strength, power, independence. When I look at people who are cowardly and just following the herd and worried about what their mothers-in-laws are going to think about them, I feel disgust for them. But philosophically, it seems like all he can say is that that's just his subjective reaction to a different kind of human being. And then he can't say that one is in fact better than another. So to step outside of the human framework, for example, it would be like saying, suppose you are a wolf. On Nietzsche's account, you feel wolf-like, and so you're naturally a predator. But when you look at rabbits and when you look at sheep, you see food. And if someone were to say, you should try to be more like a sheep or like a rabbit, your natural response psychologically as a wolf would be to say, oh, that's disgusting, right? I don't want to be a rabbit. I want to be a wolf, right? But that's just you as a wolf expressing what feels natural to you as a wolf. By contrast, if you had, say, been born a sheep, right, then naturally you would feel like a sheep. And the idea of just wandering off and going climbing mountains or whatever and seeing what's out there in the world and saying, I want to be the king sheep and conquer other herds of sheep, that would not come naturally to you. As a sheep, what you want to do just is, be peaceful and nice and just do what all of the other sheep are doing and being in the middle of the herd so that you're safe from the big bad wolf. So you would have your values that feel natural to you, but at the same time, you can't legislate and say the sheep way of life is the best way of life for all animals. Right? It's just a subjective projection. So from Nietzsche's perspective, then, if we come back to the human beings, it's very hard for him to say there is such a thing as one right psychological type for human beings. It's the master type, right? And that everyone else is degraded. Instead, it seems like what he would have to say is, well, naturally, some people are more like sheep. And that seems to be true. Right? Some people just want to go along with the herd. They're not particularly ambitious. And some people are, of course, crackling with purpose and very vital and very independent-minded and like to assert themselves over. But that's just the way they are. And we can't really say that one kind of human being is better than the other. So I think then Nietzsche, in his heart of hearts, would like to say that the master type, right, that's going to evolve into Übermensch and lead the human beings on, that's the right way for human beings to live. He would like to, but at the same time, philosophically, he does not have the underlying metaphysics or epistemology to be able to ground that. It seems like all he can do is say, that's a subjective projection for me. I, Nietzsche, happen to respond to that particular type of person. There's one other thing, again, your question is very rich. I would like to say that I think as part of Nietzsche's official philosophy, though, he cannot go too far down the road of legislating what a healthy psychology, a healthy morality looks like and what's going to come out of that. So, he might then say that someone like Zarathustra, the Zarathustra character, who's a his replacement prophet, if we use the language of prophet, that something special is working through Zarathustra, and that Zarathustra is pointing us in a certain direction, that perhaps we should follow Zarathustra or channel our own inner Zarathustra to become more like him. That Nietzsche sees himself almost as a pre-prophet. I'm pointing toward the kinds of people who are going to be the Zarathustras, and maybe I'm not even Zarathustra myself. But then I, as Nietzsche, I can't tell you what Zarathustra is going to come up with. If Zarathustra is the new prophet, I can't tell you what words are going to come out of his mouth. Or if Zarathustra or Zarathustra Plus is going to be the new legislator who creates a new set of values, well, I'm not that Zarathustra. I can't tell you what that set of values. Maybe it will come out in the form of an artistic expression. Maybe it will come out in the form of a galactic exploration, or a scientific, or a political, or a militaristic, or maybe even a new religious, form of values. But I'm not in a position to do so. Epistemologically, I, Nietzsche, do not have the standing to legislate for the future Zarathustras what those new value sets are going to be. So in that sense, the world has to remain open-ended to whatever the Zarathustras and the future prophets come out with.
Just reading Nietzsche, I'm thinking, man, this man was walking on thin ice. As far as his interpretations go, just his separation of masters and slaves is just asking for is asking for disaster. Nietzsche is like, he placed a bomb and then he ran away and just looking at it, and
Well,
also
yes.
the blonde beast, and as if that was not enough, he said a Germanic blonde beast.
At one point, yeah. The other possibility is that Nietzsche wants that interpretation. And that he does at various points say, if we were to take the mass of mankind, huge numbers of people, and sacrifice them and do horrible things to them, if out of that came the Zarathustras and the Übermenschen, that would be worth it. Right? So we do have these scattered phrases, and that's not setting up for a misinterpretation, that's setting up for a legitimate interpretation.
Okay. And he also said at some point that as a teacher, you have to be open to be either a blessing to humankind or a disaster. So he did know there was a bit of a risk, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
you have, so the Nazis, the Nazi killing units. Number one, do you think they saw themselves as Übermensch? And then number two, if they did so, do you think it caused an internal conflict because they were supposed to be strong and tough and, you know, but then again, they had to alleviate their emotional pressure from work, because we found that with the mobile killing units, these people needed to drink afterwards. And they also discovered, I think it's called a Hawker's album, which is about zoo at Treblinka, that they had a zoo there where the killers would go and be kind to animals as they were killing. So it was kind of like a coping mechanism for people. Do you think that, okay, so did they see themselves as as these overmen, and do you think it caused like internal conflict?
Well, I think definitely it does. So that the official aspiration is that you are beyond good and evil, or at least traditional good and evil, that you have a higher morality and a new morality, and that you, by virtue of your fortunate circumstance to have been born in the culture that you are, or the political regime that you are a part of, have the chance to transcend traditional morality and go on to create the new and better society. But then, as you say, that generates a huge amount of internal conflict, right, with people. Now, what you can say is to say, well, if you have the wrong so-called higher morality and it's leading you to kill all sorts of people, but there still is some shred of natural, normal humanity in you, you are setting yourself up for huge internal psychological trauma. And I think that's probably the better interpretation. I think if we're going to frame this within Nietzschean language, Nietzsche, as though, would say, here we just have people who are somewhere in the middle. They have the aspiration, but they don't actually have what it takes to fully realize that aspiration. So they are not Übermenschen, but they are Übermenschen wannabes, and the wannabes are going to be, in a problematic state. But there's a more general point here to tie back to one of your earlier questions about philosophy in general, and we've been exploring Nietzsche a lot more in this discussion. But it's important to point out that Nietzsche was part of a broader German trend in the 19th century. So if you think of the other giant names now in German intellectual life from the 19th century or the 1800s, Nietzsche comes at the tail end of that 19th century. If you go back to the beginning, the ruling philosopher of German intellectual life is Hegel. All right, and by the time we get to the middle part of the century, we look back and many people are celebrating Karl Marx. And what they all have in common, though, is that they are anti-liberal in a very fundamental way. They are anti-individualistic. They are anti-rational. They are all full of disgust for what they think of as more Western civilization, Enlightenment traditions with emphasizing the individual and reason and being capitalists and trade and industrial revolution and tolerant and so forth. That's all alien to all of them. So what you find explicitly in someone like Hegel is a more nationalistic version. Somehow the German people embody the spirit of God, and he's more religion friendly. And that God has an ultimate story and an ultimate plot line that he wants humanity to go for, and Germans are the vehicle through which that ultimate destiny of human beings are going to be realized. And that there are special individuals, great human beings in history like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Napoleon, who are the vehicles to take a nation and take it on to the next stage. And that if they have to trample on and wipe out huge numbers of people in order to lift the nation to its God-given status in all of ultimate society, that's perfectly fine. That higher political morality, so to speak, trumps lower ordinary morality. And so that is not Nietzschean per se, but that's another huge influence on German intellectual life. All of the neo-Hegelians, so to speak, who are also strongly part of German intellectual life by the time we get into the early 20th century. And then, of course, we have the Marxists, and the Marxists want to say, there is a march of history, and we have transcended feudalism, and now we're in the midst of capitalism, but we are going to transcend capitalism and bring about this new higher society. But in order to get there, there has to be a violent revolution and a lot of ugliness and wiping out of huge numbers of people. And there has to be a special elite of people who speak for the masses and embody the masses, the dictatorship of the proletariat, who again are higher than traditional bourgeois morality, higher than traditional religious morality, who can do anything that will kill off the existing institutions and those who hold the power in order to bring society to the next stage. So what you then have is, whether you have Hegelians or Marxists or Nietzscheans and various other sub-schools, all of them coming out of this German philosophy that are pointing toward saying, don't worry about traditional morality, so to speak. Do whatever you need to, however violent, to effect a revolution in all of society to take us to the next stage. So the people who are in the killing squads and various other people doing nasty things all over in the lead up to World War II and during World War II. I think you would have to then get down to the individual level pretty quickly to say whether they're more inspired by Nietzsche, more inspired by Hegel, more inspired by Marx, whether it's just a mixture in some generic fashion of all of these in order to figure out what's going on in any of those individuals per se.
See, this is why I think postmodernism is a tool for transcending your personal conflict instead of rejecting rational counter arguments. But that's outside of the topic. So my last question, because I know I have to let you go, is okay. So Nietzsche was misinterpreted. Um, as far as the elites go, going from self-actualization to concentration camps is quite a hard pivot. Because I know as far as intelligence goes, his sister was not exactly a diamond in the rough, but the rest of elites were educated. Did they actually misinterpret it? I don't want to be conspiratorial, but just want to know if it seems,
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, by the elites, I think there would be two subcategories that are worth talking about here. One would be the political philosopher elites. So these would be people who, in the 1920s, joined the Nazi Party, and or in the early 1930s, before Hitler came to power. So then you would say these are people who are intelligent, well educated, and they must be joining the party not just for political opportunistic reasons, because it's not clear in the 1920s that the Nazis are just one tiny party out of so many kicking around in the German landscape, that's going to be the party that leads you to power, right? So you must be joining it because you believe in those ideals. And if you're joining and you believe in those ideals, but you're a highly educated person, that's one kind of political elite. I think another kind of elite would be people who are not necessarily philosophers, not necessarily planning to be political activists. They don't want to have government office even if the Nazis do come to party, but they are physicists or biologists or chemists or anthropologists or whatever. And again, very educated people, and they express in some way support for National Socialist philosophy and ideology in the 1920s. They vote for the party and so forth. So that would be two kinds of elites. And maybe you would want to include in that group people who are professors in other disciplines or high school teachers. To become a high school teacher in Germany in the 1920s, you have to be a well-educated person. So the point then is that there are lots and lots of these people in the 1920s who are willing to come forth publicly and say, I am an advocate for this political party, to vote for it, to show up for the meetings, to buy certain newspapers and not other newspapers, because those newspapers are political party organs and so on. So I think you do have to say that yes, they believe in the principles. So they think in the 1920s of National Socialism as an ideal. So they believe economically in some sort of socialism, or they believe that nationalism is a proper ideological framework. And that what the Nazis are doing is emphasizing this one collective, the nation, the German ethnicity as proper, and I'm devoted to that. And that the proper economic policy is going to be some sort of government management of the economy, some sort of socialism. I'm anti-capitalist and so on. And that here we have a program that identifies that. So, if we name names, we do mention people like Moeller van den Broek, right, who wrote a book in the early 1920s called The Third Reich. I think that was in 1923 that one came out. And it was a bestseller, and this guy's a PhD, and he's arguing explicitly, saying that we have to have some sort of National Socialism, and this is 10 years before the Nazis come to power. Martin Heidegger, some people think he's the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Explicitly in favor of National Socialist political philosophy as well. And there are lots and lots of other people with PhDs in the relevant fields who are signing onto it. So I think they are true believers. And it would be, I think, no different. We jump now to the 2020s. I'm living right now and working in the United States. And we say, we have our big political parties. We have lots of people who are members of either political party for opportunistic reasons, for herd following reasons, but huge numbers of people who are thoughtful, well educated people, and they believe that those parties embody the right ideals, and so they are idealists in that sense. I don't think it's any different now from the way it was in Germany in the 1920s.
Yeah, it's well, I see the paradox in seeing utopian idealism and then claim relativism at the same time.
Mm.
Maybe there's like a shift in postmodernism, but they will not be postmodernists anymore because it's like a universalism of having a utopia and bringing people there. Anyway, so
Yes, no, you're right.
and I think Goebbels I think he had a PhD also, and he was like a fan of Freud or something. Where can people find you? Your book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, is kind of like a masterpiece. There's also an audiobook.
Yes, well, the books, yeah, Nietzsche and the Nazis and explaining postmodernism. We didn't get to postmodernism. That's fine. Those are at Amazon, and there are audiobooks at YouTube. So, yeah, thanks you for the plug of those. But then, yeah, to find me in general, just stephenhicks.org is my website, and most of my material is there. I do a podcast called Open College Podcast, and also we do have some courses available that I've taught for the new Peterson Academy, so I can be found there. So I would just say the easiest way would be to Google my name and follow one's nose, whatever one's interests are.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of your work.
No, these were great questions, and they took us into some deep territory. So I appreciate the hour we spent.
Yeah. So look, anytime you're available or your schedule allows, I would like to talk about postmodernism, which is kind of close to me as well. So that's an open invitation.